Welcome everyone, my name is Tomasz Sawczuk. I am a political editor at the Polish Kultura Liberalna magazine, and we are here today at the conference Rebellion of the People, talking European politics with Sylvie Kauffmann, who is a columnist at the French journal Le Monde. Sylvie, in your professional experience, you have worked in Poland, in the United States, in Russia, and in France, obviously. There's a lot of talk on illiberalisms and populisms emerging in those countries. Do you see more differences or similarities between the politics in those countries?
There are both differences and similarities. I think the common thread is that there is a deep crisis of representative democracy across our countries. So it has different forms, different degrees of intensity. I think the worst or the deepest crisis probably is in the United States.
All right, why is that so?
Because they have, the country is extremely divided, polarized. I think this is where we saw the emergence of this phenomenon of alternative facts, post-truth media environment, and it became a rule. Actually, it became a rule of the game, and then European countries, kind of adopted the same, unwillingly mostly, but the same system. But the whole, I think the crisis really started in the United States with the campaign of the presidential campaign of 2016 and the election of Donald Trump.
So you see this as a kind of a breaking point?
I think it was a turning point. So you may remember that there was, before the election of Donald Trump, there was the referendum, Brexit referendum in June 2016 in Britain, which was part of the same crisis.
Many people said that it
trend.
will improve Trump's chances of winning.
Yes, but I think we didn't realize that of course, the referendum, the result of the referendum was a big shock to, to other Europeans, but I don't think we realized at that stage how deep the crisis would affect, how deeply it would affect British democracy, and which now we see, openly and quite spectacularly. While in the US we saw that the crisis was already emerging, and that we were talking about checks and balances, whether they would work or not, and over the past 2.5 years, or almost 3 years actually, we see that the crisis has been deepening and deepening in the political crisis, the crisis of the representative democracy in the US, and we have this populist leader who is President of the United States, who is, disturbing the whole relationship with its foreign allies and so on. And consequently, we had in most our countries, and of course you may also say that Poland was before this.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about this, because Poland was 2015,
right?
So it was before Trump.
Again, I think when PiS won the election, we saw it as a Polish phenomenon. We thought,
so it's a local peculiarity, right?
You may say that there was also Orban, who had been there since 2010, right? But I think at that stage, we saw it as separate phenomenons. So Hungary, of course, has its own specificity, post-communist country. Viktor Orban was a very original leader, if you want, quite unique in his way of governing and the culture he was spreading and so on. Poland was different because it's a big country. Not that Hungary is irrelevant, but it's of course bigger than Hungary. It's more important for the European Union. It was a country which was playing a role in the a big role in the European Union, and so we saw, okay, it's Poland, it's got its own reasons why this nationalist, very conservative party won the election. The PO made mistakes, and and it took time, I think, to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and to realize that it was, in fact, a much more widespread phenomenon than we thought.
So why are you saying that something that was, from the French perspective, seen primarily as an Eastern European phenomenon, then emerged at the core of your own politics, right?
Because we used to talk of this East-West divide,
And
like
in this regard,
and in fact, the East trend was exported to the West in a way, right?
So the progress came from the East. One might say.
No. I mean, I think the trouble is ours, all of us, And as I said, it's got different manifestations according to the culture, the history, the level of economic development. There are several factors which make these things a little bit different from one another. But then we realized. So, for instance, we had in France we had the presidential election in 2017. And which ended in a duel between Macron and Marine Le Pen. And we assumed that we were saved from populism or from a far-right threat because Macron saved us. And the voters, choose the reasonable candidate. And so it was, if you remember, it was seen as a big victory against the populist wave.
Yes. Well,
right?
On the other hand, some of us pointed out that the number of his votes, especially in the first round,
yes.
was not that much higher than votes of either Marine Le Pen or Mélenchon.
Yeah, but that's the French electoral system. It's always a little bit like this. So in the end, in the second round, the one who is elected, yes. And it's the legitimate president. So. And I think actually this system, which was built by General de Gaulle, protects us very efficiently, yeah. But Macron himself, in a way, 2 years later became a target of this rebellion himself, He was the victor of this rebellion. He managed to get elected, but then he had to be confronted. He was faced with the same illness.
Let's return this in a second. I would like to first ask you about the peace or the law and justice strand of politics, because at your panel at the conference, you said that this is a peculiar form of a political or a specific form of a political party, and at Le Monde you discuss how to describe this phenomenon.
Well,
so would you expand on this?
We have this problem with all these new parties. We also had the problem with the five-star movement in Italy, because they are not exactly far-right parties. I mean, Salvini's party, the League, we call it far-right party. But for us, far-right parties is the what used to be National Front of Marine Le Pen. It's called National Rally. And we think peace is law and justice is a different brand of party. It's very nationalist, it's Eurosceptic, it's very conservative, socially conservative, but it's not a far-right party.
Because
I think you have your own far-right party here, right? So,
yes.
It was so
in what way is it not far-right, would you say?
Far-right is extremely authoritarian, has kind of militias, is very often supported by militias. It's almost for us, far-right is neo-fascist, if you want, and I don't think peace qualifies.
So what do you call it in the end?
So we usually call it nationalist conservative or national conservative party, Okay. Some of my colleagues still call it ultra conservative party. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go back to France then, because you were mentioning that the problems came back at Macron, and I think that you wanted to mention the Yellow Vest protests.
The Yellow Vest, yeah.
So, do you think that those protests changed something in French politics? Or
Very
no?
much so, yeah. I think it was a deep shock for, you know, it lasted several months. It was every Saturday from November to May, probably. I think they have just resumed, but there are very few numbers at the moment on the last 2 Saturdays. So it was like a few thousand all over France. So it's decreased, but I think it's now, because every Saturday of demonstration was called Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, and I think we're now around Act 44, 45, something like this. So you see, that
yes,
has
so
been a really
serious.
long protest. And it was sometimes extremely violent, and it was a level of violence that we hadn't seen in France on that scale and on that intensity. And I mean, we're a country which is used to public demonstrations and sometimes rioting, but this was really
so
much
what's the meaning of
worse
it in
than
your
we
opinion?
had. So it was a real revolt, but it was a revolt by people who had not been revolting before, kind of lower middle class people, people who were not unemployed, people who had jobs, but who saw their standard of living stagnating and who had a very profound feeling of injustice. They felt that they were ill-treated, that they were abandoned by the public service and by national solidarity. You have to remember that France is a very egalitarian country.
Yes, and this is why I want to ask you about this, because from the Polish perspective, when the French people protest because of poor social services, we think, we look at it and we think, like, well, they've got quite a lot of social services, so how is that possible?
That's a very good point, because we, for instance, in my paper, we ran a story, it was an interview of a young couple who was protesting on a roundabout with yellow vests. And our reporter went down with them on their budget, their family budget, what they earned, what they spent. And of course they had a very low, they had 4 children, so the mother didn't work outside, and the father had a very low wage. But I realized when I looked at all those numbers that in fact his wage was almost doubled by social benefits, right? So family allowances, housing allowances, you know, things like that, and then health care free, education free. So, and these people felt abandoned. And I thought, wow, you know, the solidarity is working. My taxes are helping to support them, to enforce social justice, and still they are unhappy and frustrated, and they feel abandoned.
So what's the explanation for this?
The explanation, I think, is that it's injustice. It's that we don't have equality of chances. We realize that, yes, there is solidarity and so on, but somebody who is born in this area of France, in such a family, with such a level of education, doesn't have the same chances as, let's say, my children. You know, people are very much aware of this, and also because of globalization, those low wages, those low paying jobs have disappeared. And or they get lower and lower wages. So it's a combination of factors which make these people unhappy, and also they feel that they are badly treated by the elites. And so it was, as everywhere,
and
a
so
revolt against
one
the
of
elites.
Macron's responses was to organize a series of national debates after the protests. So could you comment on his reaction to the protests?
Yeah, so I think it has changed Macron very much.
Really?
So this protest, yes, because he understood, you know, Macron campaigned on change, on new politics, on I understand there's a big crisis in the world, and I'm going to do things differently with you. And once he was elected president, he behaved like Jupiter, you know, he had this vertical way of governing, and he came across as really arrogant because he had those little you know, catchphrases like, you're looking for a job, just if I cross the street with you and I find you a job, and it's not that easy, of course. So that antagonized people, and people had a feeling that he was not keeping his promises. Now, I think he really understood that with the Yellow Vest, you know, it was traumatic for him, because there was a level of hatred directed directly to him and at him. And so we see now in the autumn a new Macron. That's the second part of his term, so he calls it Acte 2, you know, second act of his term, where he's much more open to dialogue. He's much more moderate in the way he talks to people. He's careful about not having those, you know, provoking comments. And he's not giving up reforms. That's an interesting thing to notice. He keeps his reform agenda on, but he's proceeding in a very different way. For instance, now he's starting the pensions reform, which is obviously a difficult and important reform. And he says he's going to take his time. He's consulting the unions, which he he didn't do before. He's talking to the local mayors a lot, whom he had completely neglected before. It was all done from Paris, and he was not talking to all these small elected officials. Now he's talking to them all the time. And the debate, the big national debate that you mentioned, was part of this.
But wouldn't you say that during those debates, it was once again Macron alone in light and solving one-handedly solving all the problems of the
yes
people?
And no, because that was that was the part you saw, that he launched those debates. He went he organized meetings with, let's say, 300 mayors. We have 38,000 mayors in France, so there's quite a lot. And, you know, he would talk for hours and hours, sometimes up to 6 hours with them. But that was the visible face of the public face of those debates. But there were a lot, like I think about 10,000 other debates which happened, which were organized. There was a website where you could register. You know, I could, for instance, say, look, I'm having a debate in my garage next week. Whoever wants to come, just register and turn up. And this happened a lot. That was quite an interesting exercise that kept people engaged in a public debate rather than having them on the street.
All right, so let's get to Macron's Act 2. Because from what I understand, this also means a change in his foreign policy. And for the past years, he was rather hostile to the Polish government because of the rule of law matters. Is it possible that now, as he wants to reopen his politics, this approach will also change or not?
Probably. Macron had another big failure in his first part of his term, which was his European policy. If you remember, he started with this big speech in La Sorbonne with 70-plus proposals.
And an idea of a close partnership with
Germany. And he relied on Germany to implement this agenda with him. But just at the same time, there were elections in Germany in September 2017, and the CDU and Mrs. Merkel's, not exactly lost, but were very, very much weakened in those elections. And then it took 6 months to form, to negotiate a coalition for a government. So Macron was left hanging with his wonderful proposals. And nothing was, or very, very little was achieved. So now he sees what's going on in Germany. So he's regained his footing internally, let's say. I mean, not completely, but he's back to 38% public support when he was down to almost 20. Yeah, so he feels able to act again. Yeah, I mean, it's not Putin's rates, but he feels strong enough to start to initiate another agenda in Europe because he really wants to push. this agenda in Europe. And so what he does now is, okay, he sees that Germany is not ready, that it's, you know, it has its own domestic political problems. So he says France still has to work very closely with Germany because that's the way Europe works and that's the way France works, and it's something which is not going to change. But the relationship with Germany is necessary but not sufficient. So he's going to, and he's already doing it, you know, to work with other member states on a bilateral basis to strengthen those links, to have more support for his agenda. And Poland will be part of this, I understand. Poland will be part of this agenda, not that he sees Poland as an obvious ally in his agenda, because of course this is not the trend, but that he understands that he needs to rally people around him. He cannot work alone with Germany, especially if Germany is not responding.
Sylvie, thank you very much for this conversation. I would like also to thank our viewers for the patience, and I would like to tell you that you can find Kultura Liberalna articles in Polish at kulturaliberalna.pl and in English at liberalculture.org. Thank you very much for watching.